The cold was a constant companion. It lived in the damp stone of the orphanage, in the thin wool of her blanket, and in the gnawing emptiness of her stomach. Ilara knew the feeling of cold better than she knew the memory of her own mother's face. Here, in the Salt Fang Pack's coastal village, the cold was a predator, seeping in from the sea, carried on a wind that smelled of brine and regret. She was a foundling, a piece of driftwood washed ashore and grudgingly given shelter. Worthless. The word was stamped onto her soul like the faded brand on a stray sheep. Lyra, whose parents were respected fishers, made sure Ilara never forgot it. Driftwood, Lyra would sneer, knocking the bucket from Ilara's hands. Good for nothing but feeding the fire. And Ilara would just pick it up, her hands already numb from the icy water, and say nothing. Her silence was a shield, thin and brittle, but the only one she had. Today the wind was a monster, shrieking off the Greyjaw Sea and tearing at the thatched roofs. The elders had forbidden anyone from going near the cliffs, but a young pup from the lower dens had wandered off, and his mother was frantic. No one else would go. No one else would risk the king's wrath for straying into the forbidden territories near his clifftop fortress. No one but the worthless girl. She pulled her threadbare shawl tighter, the wind slicing through it like claws. The path was treacherous, slick with sea spray and loose shale. Below, the waves crashed against black, jagged rocks, a symphony of destruction. She kept her head down, her eyes scanning the gorse and heather for any sign of the lost child. It was the pain that drew her off the path. It wasn't a sound, it was a feeling. A deep, resonant agony that vibrated in the bones of the earth, a silent scream that tore at the edges of her awareness. She felt it in her teeth, a sympathetic ache that made her jaw clench. She had always been this way, sensitive to the suffering of things. A bird with a broken wing could make her nauseous with its frantic, silent terror. This was different. This was a pain the size of a mountain, ancient, overwhelming. Curiosity, or perhaps a foolish sort of compassion, pulled her toward a fissure in the cliff face she'd never noticed before. It was almost perfectly hidden by a curtain of sea-weathered ivy. The feeling of anguish pulsed from within, a dark beacon. She hesitated, the elder's warnings ringing in her ears. The Alpha King, Kalen, valued his privacy above all else. His territory was sacrosanct, but the pup and the pain. She slipped through the opening. The sea cave was vast, a cathedral of dripping stone and echoing silence. The air was thick with the scent of ozone, salt, and something else. Something wild and dying. In the center of the cavern, shimmering with a faint, sickly light, was the source of the agony. It was a wolf. No, it was the ghost of a wolf. A creature of impossible size, its form wrought from shadow and moonlight. Its fur, which might have once been the color of polished silver, was dull and patchy. Its massive body was contorted, coiled in on itself. Ethereal chains of darkness seemed to bind its limbs, pulling it tight, each link a point of exquisite torture. It didn't breathe, but its whole form shuddered with a silent, unending torment. Ilara had heard whispers of the king's beast, the living embodiment of his alpha spirit, the source of his power. They said it had been grievously wounded in the Unification War decades ago. They said the king kept it hidden, that its pain was his pain. Looking at it, she knew the whispers were true. This was not a living thing anymore. It was a memory of life, trapped in a nightmare. Her heart cracked. To be so magnificent, so powerful, and to be reduced to this. It was an obscenity. Slowly, as if approaching a wounded god, she stepped closer. The beast's great head was resting on the stone floor. One eye, a slit of molten gold, half open and vacant with suffering. It didn't seem to notice her. It was lost in its own private hell. Tears welled in Ilara's eyes. This wasn't right. Nothing deserved this. Death was a mercy. Death was a kindness this creature had been denied for far too long. From a small leather pouch at her belt, she took out a small, tightly wrapped bundle. Crushed death sleep berries. She carried them for animals caught in traps, creatures whose suffering was too great. A quick, painless end. It was all she had to offer. Her hands trembled as she unwrapped the dark, fragrant paste. This was the king's beast, the king's very soul. To do this was treason. It was a death sentence. But to walk away, to leave it like this, that felt like a worse crime. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice swallowed by the cavern's immensity. "I'm so sorry. You deserve peace." She knelt before the colossal, spectral head and held out the paste on the palm of her hand. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, the great head shifted. The single golden eye focused on her, and for the first time, she felt its awareness. It was a weary, ancient intelligence that saw straight through her, past the worthless foundling to the quivering core of her pity. A long, shadowy tongue, cool as the grave, rasped against her palm, licking the paste clean. Ilara snatched her hand back, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had done it. She had poisoned the Alpha King's soul. The beast's head sank back to the stone. The terrible, silent shivering that had racked its body began to slow. The sickly light around it flickered. The dark chains binding it seemed to loosen, their edges blurring. A great sigh seemed to pass through the cave, a release of pressure so profound Ilara felt it in her own lungs. The golden eye closed. The light winked out. The beast grew utterly still. She had killed it. A sob of terror and relief caught in her throat. She scrambled backward, turning to flee, to run back into the storm and never stop. A wall of muscle and fury blocked the entrance. He was larger than any man she had ever seen, broad-shouldered and filling the entire fissure of rock. His face was all harsh lines and sharp angles, beautiful in the way a winter storm is beautiful, cold, merciless, and powerful. His eyes, the exact same shade of molten gold as his beast's, were fixed on her. They burned with an intensity that stripped the air from her lungs. The Alpha King, Kalen. He didn't look at the still form of his wolf. He didn't have to. The sudden, shocking silence in their bond had been like his own heart stopping. He looked only at her, at the girl, reeking of fear and the sweet, cloying scent of death sleep. She fell to her knees, unable to stand under the weight of his gaze. "Your Majesty," she stammered, the words barely a breath. "Forgive me. It was in so much pain." He said nothing. He simply walked past her, his long, dark coat whispering over the stone. He knelt beside his beast, his huge frame seeming to shrink as he reached out a hand, not to touch the spectral fur, but to hover it just above the wolf's head. His expression was unreadable, a mask of granite. Ilara waited for the roar of rage, for the feel of his hands on her throat, for the swift, brutal end she knew she deserved. Instead, a sound broke the silence, a soft gasp. It came from the king. His golden eyes were wide with disbelief. He looked from his still beast to her, and for the first time, she saw a crack in the icy mask. It was confusion. Awe. Then, the beast moved. Its great head lifted from the stone, not with the agonizing slowness of before, but with a fluid grace she hadn't thought possible. The chains of shadow that had bound it were gone. The sickly light was replaced by a soft, healthy silver glow. It was still a creature of spirit, but it was no longer a prisoner. The beast's golden eyes opened, clear and intelligent, and fixed on Ilara. It took a step toward her, then another. It lowered its massive head and nudged her shoulder, a gesture so gentle it felt like a dream. The touch was not cold, as she'd expected, but warm, a deep, thrumming warmth that spread through her chest. The poison hadn't killed it. It had saved it. It had severed the tethers of dark magic that had been slowly torturing it to death for decades. The Alpha King rose to his full, intimidating height. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a low rumble, like stones grinding deep within the earth. "What did you do?" She couldn't answer. She could only stare as the king's soul, the magnificent beast of legend, rested its head in her lap and chose her as its own. He took her. There was no other word for it. One moment she was a kneeling, terrified girl in a sea cave. The next, she was being swept up into his arms and carried out into the raging storm as if she weighed nothing. The lost pup was forgotten. Her old life was forgotten. The journey to the Saltfang Keep was a blur of wind, rain, and the solid, unyielding heat of his body. He held her against his chest, shielding her from the worst of the gale. She was acutely aware of the hard muscle beneath his soaked tunic, the scent of pine and winter that clung to him, the thunderous, steady beat of his heart against her ear. It was terrifying. It was the safest she had ever felt. The keep was a fortress of black stone, perched on the highest cliff like a bird of prey. It was a place of legends and fear, a place she had only ever seen from a distance. Now, its great wooden gates groaned open for her. Guards in wolf-pelt cloaks stared in stunned silence as their Alpha King strode through the courtyard, carrying a slip of a girl, his stride long and purposeful. He didn't take her to the dungeons. He took her to a suite of rooms high in the main tower, with a hearth already blazing and a bed piled high with furs. He set her down gently on a velvet-cushioned bench by the fire. "Stay," he commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument. Then he was gone, leaving her alone in a room larger than the entire orphanage. For a few days she was a ghost in the castle. Servants brought her food on silver trays, averting their eyes. They left her fresh clothes of soft wool and linen, finer than anything she had ever touched. No one spoke to her. No one told her what was happening. She was a secret, a puzzle the king was still trying to solve. Her only visitor was the beast. It would appear without warning, fading through the stone walls like smoke. It would lie before her fire, its silver form radiating a gentle warmth, its golden eyes watching her every move. She learned to talk to it, her whispers filling the silent room. She told it about the orphanage, about Lyra, about the constant biting cold. The beast would listen, its great head cocked, occasionally giving a soft huff of air that ruffled her hair. She knew the beast was him, a part of him. And this part, this quiet, watchful soul, was not the cold, merciless tyrant of the stories. It was lonely. On the fourth day, the king himself returned. He stood in the doorway, watching her as she braided a stray piece of leather for the beast to nudge with its nose. "He will only allow you near him," Kaelin stated. It wasn't an accusation, it was a fact, stated with a kind of grudging wonder. Alara's hands stilled. She kept her eyes on the beast. "He's not in pain anymore." "No." Kaelin walked into the room, stopping a careful distance away. "For 50 years, I have shared his agony. Every day, a constant, grinding torment from a curse I earned in my pride. I have brought in every healer, every sorcerer. Nothing worked. They all said the curse was woven into his spirit. To remove it would be to unmake him." He finally looked at her, his golden eyes intense. "You fed him a common poison, and it severed the curse without harming him. How?" She shook her head, a knot of fear tightening in her stomach. "I don't know. I couldn't stand his suffering. I wanted it to end. That is all." Honesty. It was all she had. His gaze was heavy, searching. He was reading her, she realized, trying to find the lie, the ambition, the hidden power. She had none. She was just Alara. "My court believes you are a witch," he said, his voice flat. They believe you ensorcelled my beast to use it against me. They demand your execution. Ice flooded her veins. Of course. This was the price for her moment of foolish compassion. And you? She whispered, forcing herself to meet his eyes. What do you believe? A muscle jumped in his jaw. I believe my wolf has not rested peacefully in my lifetime. I believe that for the first time since I was a boy, the screaming in my own soul has stopped. He took a step closer. And I believe it is because of you. This was the beginning of their strange, fragile truce. They were thrown together, two people bound by a miracle neither understood. The court was a sea of sharks, and she was the blood in the water. Whispers followed her everywhere. Lyra, who had been brought to the keep with other prominent families to attend the king, was the loudest. "The orphan witch!" she'd hiss, just loud enough for Alara to hear. "She'll kill us all in our beds. The king is blinded by her dark magic." Kaelin's enemies on the council, old wolves who chafed under his rule, saw her as a weapon. They tried to approach her, offering alliances, promising protection. She refused them all, clinging to the one person who seemed to see her as something other than a witch or a tool: the king himself. One night, a political crisis erupted. A delegation from the neighboring Stonecrest pack arrived, demanding recompense for fishing rights Kaelin had revoked. The meeting in the Great Hall was tense. The Stonecrest Alpha was arrogant, pushing Kaelin, testing him. "Your pack grows weak, Kaelin," the Alpha sneered. "You entertain hedge witches while your borders crumble." He gestured dismissively toward Alara, who stood in the shadows near the throne, where Kaelin insisted she remain. Before Kaelin could respond, one of the Stonecrest guards lunged, not at the king, but at her. It was a test, a provocation. Time seemed to slow. The guard was a blur of snarling fury. Alara had no time to scream, but she didn't have to. Kaelin moved with a speed that was utterly inhuman. He was in front of her in a heartbeat, his arm catching the guard's throat. There was a sickening crunch. The guard dropped to the floor, unmoving. The hall fell silent. Kaelin stood over the body, his chest heaving. He turned, not to the stunned Stonecrest Alpha, but to Alara. His golden eyes were blazing, but as they met hers, the fire was banked by a fierce, terrifying protectiveness. He reached out and cupped her jaw, his thumb stroking her cheek as if to reassure himself she was unharmed. It was a gesture of shocking intimacy in the middle of a hostile court. "Mine," he growled, the word echoing in the silence. It wasn't directed at her. It was a proclamation to the entire world. The Stonecrest delegation left without another word. That night, the dynamic shifted. They had been forced to trust each other, and in that flash of violence, something new and dangerous had been forged between them. The intimacy was no longer just a slow creep. It had been ignited under fire. But in the shadows, Lyra watched, her face a mask of jealous hatred. She saw the way the king looked at the worthless foundling. She saw the beast that followed Alara like a shadow. And she knew she had to destroy it. She had to destroy her. Lyra understood the Saltfang pack. She understood its soul was forged in strength, and its greatest fear was weakness. Mercy was a weakness. A foundling was a weakness. And a king who favored a foundling over the traditions of his pack was the greatest weakness of all. She began to whisper, not just to the other nobles but to the guards, the servants, the old wolves who remembered Kaelin's father. She twisted the story, painting Alara not as a healer but as a saboteur. She didn't heal the beast, she'd say, her voice full of false concern. She poisoned it. She broke it. She severed it from the pack's traditions, binding it only to herself. The king's power is now held hostage by an orphan witch. The lie was potent. It fed on the pack's deepest insecurities. The beast was sacred, a symbol of their collective strength. The idea that an outsider, a nobody, had tampered with it was sacrilege. The mood in the keep began to sour, turning from suspicion to outright hostility. Alara felt the shift. The averted eyes became glares, the whispers became jeers. She felt their hatred like a physical force, a suffocating pressure. She tried to make herself smaller, to become invisible again. But it was too late. Kalen's favor had made her a target. He saw it too. His rage was a cold, simmering thing. He wanted to crush them, to make them pay for every look, every word. But he was still their king. "They are fools," he snarled one evening, pacing the length of her chamber while the spectral beast watched him from the hearth. "They fear what they don't understand." "They fear me," Alara said quietly. She was sitting by the window, looking out at the churning gray sea. "And they fear you for choosing me." He stopped pacing and came to stand behind her. He placed his hands on her shoulders, his touch warm and grounding. "Let them fear," he said, his voice a low vibration against her back. "Your place is with me." His words were a comfort, but they were also a cage. The more he protected her, the more the pack resented her. The bond between them, forged in the sea cave and tempered in crisis, was now the very thing that was isolating them. Lyra saw her opening. She went to the Council of Elders, the guardians of the pack's laws. She formally accused Alara of high treason, the willful poisoning and corruption of the Alpha's spirit. She demanded a public trial. By law, Kalen could not refuse. The trial was held in the Great Courtyard, the same place where generations of Alphas had been chosen. The entire pack was assembled, their faces a sea of grim, judgmental masks. Ilara stood alone in the center, Kalen on the raised dais behind her, his face like stone. He was her judge, but he was also her captor, bound by the very laws he was meant to enforce. Lyra presented her case. She was brilliant, her words weaving a tapestry of fear and superstition. She spoke of Alara's mysterious origins, her strange sensitivity, her unnatural calm in the face of the king's power. She brought forth witnesses from the orphanage who spoke of Alara's strange habits, her love of solitude, her knowledge of herbs, all twisted to sound like the workings of a dark witch. And then, the final, damning blow. "I present the weapon she used," Lyra announced, holding up a small pouch. "Death sleep berries, a poison known to every herbalist. She did not heal the beast. She attacked the very soul of our pack. She must be purged." A roar went up from the crowd. "Purge the witch! Death!" Alara's blood ran cold. She looked to Kalen, her eyes pleading. He was trapped. She could see the war in his eyes. The king versus the man. The law versus the truth he felt in his soul. If he defended her, he would be defying his entire pack, breaking the sacred laws. It would mean civil war. If he condemned her, he would be sacrificing the only person who had ever eased the torment inside him. He would be killing a part of himself. His face was a mask of agony. He slowly rose, his hand gripping the arm of his throne so tightly his knuckles were white. The crowd fell silent, waiting for his judgment. He looked at Alara, and his eyes were filled with a terrible, bleak despair. He was going to save his kingdom. He was going to sacrifice her. But the words he spoke were not the ones she expected. "The law is clear," he said, his voice ringing with cold authority. "For the crime of raising a hand against the Alpha's spirit, the punishment is exile. Ilara of no house, you are hereby cast out from the Saltfang pack. You will be taken to the border of the withered coast at dawn. If you ever set foot in our lands again, the punishment is death." It was not the death sentence the crowd wanted, but it was a close second. A murmur of grim satisfaction rippled through them. Lyra smiled, a triumphant, venomous curl of her lips. Exile. He was throwing her to the wolves, literally. The withered coast was a barren wasteland from which no one returned. Guards seized her arms. She didn't struggle. She just kept her eyes on Kalen. He had made his choice. Her and his pack. He had chosen his pack. The pain of it was sharper than any blade. As they dragged her away, she saw his mask finally break, just for a second. She saw a raw, devastating grief that mirrored her own. And she understood. This wasn't a punishment. It was the only way he could save her life. He was sending her away to keep her safe from the very people he was sworn to lead. It was a goodbye. The separation was a physical tearing. As the guards forced her across the barren, rocky border into the withered coast, she felt the warm, thrumming connection to the beast snap. The loss was so abrupt, so total, it brought her to her knees. A part of her had been amputated. She was alone again, colder than ever before. The withered coast was a place of gray dust and skeletal trees. The wind didn't shriek here. It mourned. A low, constant whisper that promised slow starvation or a quick death from the desperate feral wolves that hunted the wastes. For days, Alara just walked. She put one foot in front of the other, fueled by a stubborn refusal to die. The cold was a familiar ache, the hunger a dull throb. But the silence in her soul where the beast's presence used to be was the real torture. She was hollowed out. She survived. Her worthless, lonely life had taught her how. She knew which roots were edible, how to find water, how to build shelters that the wind could not tear apart. She learned the rhythms of the wasteland. Her senses, always sharp, became honed to a razor's edge. Months passed. The softness of the keep was a distant memory. Her hands became calloused, her face weathered by the relentless wind. She grew stronger, harder. But the grief remained, a cold stone in her chest. Sometimes, traders on the far roads would pass, and she would hide and listen to their talk. They spoke of the Saltfang pack. They said the Alpha King had changed. The coldness that had always been a part of him had now consumed him. He was ruling with an iron fist, his rage a tangible thing. He had systematically dismantled the old council, exiling the very elders who had supported Lyra's call for judgment. He was at war with his own people, purging the rot of their traditions with a merciless fire. Lyra, they said, had risen high in his new court. He kept her close, a constant visible reminder of the pack's betrayal. It was a cruel, calculated punishment, forcing her to witness the dismantling of the world she had fought for. Hearing his name was like a fresh wound every time. He was suffering. He had sent her away to protect her, but in doing so, he had unleashed the worst parts of himself upon his pack. His guilt was eating him alive, and she was not there to soothe it. Their parallel suffering was a chasm between them. One day, while seeking shelter in a series of caves, she found something extraordinary. The walls were covered in paintings, ancient and faded. They depicted wolves of silver light and the people who walked with them. They told a story of a bond not just between an alpha and his beast, but between the people and the spirits of the land. She saw figures with their hands outstretched, calling forth wisps of light from the earth, the spirits of ancient alphas, the ancestors of the pack. A shock went through her. She reached out and touched one of the paintings, a depiction of a woman with hair like hers, her hand resting on the head of a great wolf. As her fingers met the cool stone, a jolt of energy shot up her arm. Images flooded her mind, a lineage of women, all with a connection to the spirit world, a power not of witchcraft, but of ancestry. A spirit connection, her hidden power. She was one of them. This was her bloodline. Her family, the one she'd never known, had not been worthless. They had been guardians. The knowledge settled inside her, not with a burst of power, but with a quiet, profound sense of belonging. The hollowness in her soul began to fill, not with the beast's presence, but with something of her own. It was this newfound strength that was her undoing. She grew bolder, traveling farther, learning more from the land, and she was seen. A war party from the Stonecrest Pack. The same ones Kaelin had humiliated was scouting the withered coast. They were looking for weaknesses, for a way to strike back at the increasingly erratic Saltfang King, and they found one. They found the exiled witch. She fought, but she was 1 against 10. They cornered her, their leader, the brother of the man Kaelin had killed, grinning triumphantly. Well, well, he sneered. Look what the wasteland spat out. The Alpha King's little pet. He's torn his pack apart looking for you, did you know that? Turned it inside out. He'll trade anything to get you back. His words hit her harder than any blow. Kaelin had been looking for her. He hadn't abandoned her. He had been fighting for her all along. The Stonecrest Alpha grabbed her by the hair. You are the key to his destruction. The news of her capture spread like wildfire. The Stonecrest Pack sent a messenger to Kaelin. The terms were simple. Surrender his territory, his title, everything. Or watch her die. This was the impossible choice. His kingdom, or her. In the Saltfang Keep, Kaelin received the message. For months, he had been a man possessed, his only goal to remake his pack into something worthy of her, something he could one day bring her back to. He had sent scouts into the withered coast, but the land was vast and had yielded nothing. He had begun to despair. Now he knew where she was, in the hands of his most bitter enemy. Lyra stood before him, her face pale. You cannot, she whispered. You cannot sacrifice the pack for one girl. It is madness. Kaelin looked at her, and his eyes were dead. The coldness was gone, replaced by an emptiness that terrified her. I have no pack without her, he said, his voice hollow. I have nothing. He left the defenses of his territory undermanned. He took only his most loyal warriors. He rode not as a king going to war, but as a man going to reclaim his own soul. He would burn the world to get her back. Alara was chained to a post in the center of the Stonecrest war camp. She was cold, bruised, and exhausted, but her spirit was a defiant flame. She knew he would come. She didn't know if he would succeed, but he would come. And he did. He appeared at the edge of the camp as the sun was setting, a lone figure of terrifying fury. His beast was not with him. She could feel its distant, anxious echo, a sign of how far he had pushed their bond. The Stonecrest Alpha, Rorik, laughed. The great Alpha King, come to beg for his whore. He pressed a blade to Alara's throat. Surrender, Kaelin, or she dies now. Kaelin's face was unreadable, but his voice was raw with a pain that cut through her. Let her go, Rorik. This is between us. It is, Rorik agreed, and she is how I will unmake you. The battle was short and brutal. Kaelin's warriors engaged the Stonecrest guards, but Kaelin himself had eyes only for Alara. He fought his way toward her, a whirlwind of death and desperation. He was magnificent, a king fighting for his queen. But he was outnumbered. As he cut down one guard, another's spear found a gap in his armor, sinking deep into his side. Kaelin grunted, stumbling. He didn't stop. He ripped the spear out and kept moving, his eyes locked on hers. He was bleeding heavily, his movements growing slower. He was dying. Rorik saw his chance. He shoved Alara to the ground and advanced on the wounded king. This ends now. Kaelin met his charge, but his strength was failing. They clashed, steel ringing on steel. Kaelin was driven back, staggering. He fell to one knee, his golden eyes finding Alara's one last time, a look of profound regret. He had failed. No, Alara whispered. The word was a prayer. Rorik raised his sword for the final blow. He stood over the kneeling king, a triumphant sneer on his face. In front of his warriors, in front of the woman Kaelin had thrown everything away for, he would execute the great Alpha King. It was the ultimate humiliation. No! The word was not a whisper this time. It was a roar, a sound of pure, primal refusal that tore from Alara's throat. It was the voice of every ancestor in her bloodline. It was the voice of the land itself. Power erupted from her. It was not fire or lightning. It was light. A wave of pure silver light, the color of the beast's healthy fur, exploded from her body. The force of it threw Rorik and his nearby warriors back, as if they were toys. The chains binding her turned to dust. She rose to her feet, bathed in the ethereal glow. The air around her grew thick, heavy with an ancient presence. From the dusty ground, spirits began to rise, spectral forms of wolves and warriors, the ancient alphas from the cave paintings, their eyes burning with cold fire. They answered her call. Her grief and rage had unlocked the door. Rorik and his men stared in horror. They were no longer facing a wounded king and his captured mate. They were facing an army of ghosts, commanded by a woman who shone like a star. She walked to Kaelin, the spirits parting before her. He was slumped on the ground, his lifeblood pooling in the dust. His eyes were closed. She knelt beside him, her hands glowing with that same silver light. "I will not let you go," she whispered, her voice shaking with the force of her will. She pressed her palms against the wound in his side. It was more than just healing. It was a refusal, a defiance of death itself. She poured her own life force, her newfound ancestral power, into him. She felt the beast's spirit, faint and distant, surge toward her call, adding its strength to hers. She was the bridge, the conduit. Kaelin's eyes shot open. He gasped, a deep, shuddering breath. The bleeding stopped. Color returned to his face. The wound was closing, knitting itself back together under her hands. He stared at her, at the silver light enveloping her, at the army of ancestral spirits standing silent guard around them. He saw her not as the foundling, not as the girl he had tried to protect, but as what she truly was: power, majesty, his equal. He reached up, his hand cupping her cheek. His touch was reverent. The Stonecrest warriors, their alpha thrown aside and their courage broken by the spectral army, fled into the night. They left Kaelin and Alara alone in the sudden ringing silence, surrounded by the silent ghosts of their shared past. She collapsed against him, the power receding, leaving her weak and trembling. He caught her, holding her tight. His arms were strong and sure around her, his heart beating a steady, powerful rhythm against her back. He was alive. They were alive. He held her face in his hands, his golden eyes searching hers, filled with an emotion so raw and overwhelming it stole her breath. Ilara. He breathed her name like a prayer he had finally answered. The reunion was not just a mending of separation, but a forging of something new. He held her there, in the dust of the battlefield, and just breathed, in and out. The simple fact of their proximity was a miracle. "I was wrong," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "sending you away. It was the act of a coward. I tried to protect you from my world, but you are not meant to be protected from it. You are meant to command it." Tears streamed down her face, washing away the dust and the pain of the long months apart. "I thought I'd lost you." "Never," he vowed, his grip tightening. "Every breath I took was to find my way back to you." He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. "The guilt I carried, for what I did to my beast, to my own soul, it was a poison. You were the only antidote, and I threw you away." "You saved my life," she whispered. "I only postponed my own," he countered. He pulled back just enough to look at her, his gaze sweeping over her face as if memorizing every line. "When that spear hit me, my only regret was that I would die without telling you." Her heart stopped. "I love you, Ilara," he said, the words raw and absolute. "I love you, and it's the only truth I have left." It wasn't a king's declaration, it was a man's confession, stripped bare of all pride and power, and it was everything. "I love you," she answered, the words unlocking the last guarded chamber of her heart. The love confession wasn't a climax. It was a foundation, laid down in the quiet aftermath of the storm, ready for them to build their new world upon. They returned to the Saltfang territory not as a king and his rescued mate, but as a united power. The spectral army of ancestors faded as they crossed the border, but their presence lingered, a palpable aura of authority around Alara. The pack felt it. When she and Kaelin rode into the keep's courtyard, there were no jeers, only stunned, awed silence. Lyra was standing on the steps, her face ashen. She saw Alara, not in rags, but glowing with an inner light, her hand resting on Kaelin's arm. She saw the way the guards, the entire pack, bowed their heads in deference not just to their king, but to the woman beside him. The system she had weaponized had been broken and remade. Her world had crumbled. Kaelin dismounted and helped Alara down. He faced his pack, his voice clear and strong, without the cold, brittle rage that had defined him for months. "This is Alara, of the ancestral blood," he announced. "She is not a witch to be feared, but the lost heart of this pack, now returned. She is my mate, your queen." He didn't need to say more. The truth of it was undeniable. Alara was no longer the driftwood, the foundling. She was home. Weeks later, the new world had settled. The withered coast, touched by Alara's power, had begun to show faint signs of life, a blush of green on the gray dust. The Stonecrest pack, broken and leaderless, had sworn fealty to Kaelin, doubling his territory. The old, brittle traditions of the Saltfang were replaced by a new understanding, a balance of strength and compassion. Lyra was not executed. Alara had asked for mercy. Instead, she was stripped of her family's status and sent to work in the infirmary, to spend her days tending to the weak she had so despised. It was a fitting, quiet justice. One morning, Ilara awoke in the king's bed, tangled in warm furs and the even warmer limbs of her mate. The sun, a rare and welcome visitor on this coast, streamed through the large windows, painting the room in gold. Kaelin was watching her, a soft, rare smile on his lips. "Good morning, my queen," he murmured, his voice husky with sleep. She smiled back, a real, easy smile that reached her eyes. "Good morning, my king." Lying at the foot of the massive bed was the beast, Kaelin's soul. It was magnificent, its silver fur shining, its form solid and real. It lifted its head and gave a soft huff, its golden eyes filled with a placid contentment. The bond was whole again, but different. It no longer belonged just to Kaelin. It was a trinity, a cord of light and love that bound the three of them together. Alara reached out a hand, and Kaelin covered it with his own. She looked from the man she loved to the beast she had saved, and a profound sense of peace settled over her. The cold was finally gone, banished forever by a love that had been forged in mercy, tested by fire, and strong enough to command ghosts. She was no longer worthless, no longer alone. She belonged, and she knew, with a certainty that resonated deep in her soul, that their story was just beginning.